Hello, everybody. Feel free to, I guess, say hello in chat and tell us from where you are. We're doing a very special meetup tonight because we have a combination of the Berlin and Zurich chapters presenting this NeuroTechX event. We'll just give everybody a couple more minutes to get settled in, and then we'll jump into it. See some people that I recognize in the attendees list. Hello, Vineet. Hello, Ulrich. I really like these NeuroTechX events, seeing how many different people get on from different parts of the world. I guess that's the advantage of the online meetups. We got Paris and Berlin and Munich, San Francisco. I'm from Salt Lake City. That's where I'm sitting now. Don't know what I'm doing here.
We are covering a lot of time zones tonight.
Yeah. I see at least 6 of them in the chat. 8-hour spread. It's exciting. I had to wear my neuroscience shirt for this event. I never wear this, but I think it's kind of fun. It's from a university near me. They have a little neuroscience club, and I spoke at like a career fair last year, and they gave me this shirt. But I think it's kind of cool. There's somebody here from South Africa. I think we can go ahead and jump into it. Looks like attendees are stabilizing a little bit. And yeah, people can join as we go through some of the introduction slides. So I'm just going to share screen. Seems like everybody can hear me okay, as far as I can tell. Cool. And can you see a full screen presentation now then too?
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to the Zurich, Berlin, maybe Zurlin, maybe that's what you call it. Zurich, Berlin combo NeuroTechX Buzz and Review event, which is going to be really exciting. Of course, maybe it's not even just a Zurich Berlin event. Maybe it's a Berlin, Zurich, Salt Lake City, Paris, San Francisco, South Africa event. But I think that kind of shows off what NeuroTechX is all about, getting everybody kind of under one roof or in one community to communicate and talk about neurotechnology. And this is all of us. We have all sorts of different types of people in this room. I'm excited to engage with all of you now and after the event. If you have questions about any of the slides that you see today, please do ask. I guess before we jump into it, I'll just give a quick introduction to myself, since a lot of you from the Zurich and Berlin chapter probably don't know me. My name is Nick Halper. I'm actually a cellular neuroscientist by training, but I started at BlackRock Microsystems as an engineer and worked into a kind of executive product role, I guess, where I helped to pick and choose the technologies BlackRock commercialized, helping develop business plans for them and helping to work with some of our, I guess you'd call them clients, people that we helped get small companies off the ground. I have since actually gone on to start my own company or project called BrainGrade. BrainGrade is basically a super group of some of the Neuralink founders, Paradromics founders, and BlackRock Microsystems founders that is working on a new neuromodulation device for Alzheimer's disease. So that's what I've been spending my time for the last year doing, though I have probably many more years ahead of me working on that project, and it's an exciting one. So a lot of the people that we're going to, or a lot of the kind of like projects and stuff we're going to talk about in this presentation are people that I've worked with, and I'm really excited to see show up in the news and be able to talk about myself. So, but before we get there, I want to tell you a little bit about NeuroTechX and kind of introduce you to this Buzz and Review event. So as you all know, since you've been a part of these chapters, NeuroTechX is the neurotechnology networking group, I guess, community, you want to call them. They're worldwide. They have chapters around the globe. We're going to get into some of the numbers here in a second. But each of the chapters kind of runs on their own. They do their own thing. They have their own types of events. Some chapters do hack nights more. Some chapters do like talks and panels more. Some chapters do journal clubs. All of them do all of it, kind of. But the Buzz and Review event is the one event that every chapter has every year. And it's effectively a review of some of the cool, I guess, neurotechnology moments in the news over the last year. And so you can see here all the different chapters that ran them. We did the Latin American one last week, and the Salt Lake City, San Francisco, Vancouver, and Los Angeles one the next day. And this week is the European events. So all sorts of different ones around Europe. Really exciting. So we can see all the different chapters and online events. So as I was saying, NeuroTechX is the community for neurotechnology enthusiasts. And that includes everybody from people who are, just wanting to hear about the news of neurotechnology to people who are looking to hack together their own brain-computer interfaces, and also experts in neuromodulation, people who work at big companies like Medtronic or in some of these, kind of, invasive neuromodulation devices. All of us get together into this community, and it's exciting to see everybody participate. The goal of the community is to advance neurotechnology, and it does that in so many different ways, right? Whether that be through hack nights, where people are literally putting together the basis of new neurotechnology, or spinning out companies even. Several companies have started from neurotechnology meetup groups and people meeting each other and starting to work on devices. Or whether it's just kind of making people aware of neurotechnology and helping get people introduced to it early on. So there's all sorts of different school outreach programs and things like that we do. Specifically, my chapter is partnering not just with our local universities, but we're actually getting kits into high schools and places like that. So definitely exciting. Get people on the neurotech track early and get them excited about the stuff we're working on. And the way that NeuroTech achieves this is through their 3 pillars. The first one that I've emphasized a lot here is the community. So for any of you who aren't part of the NeuroTechX Slack, which I guess they're also developing a Discord, definitely get on it. There's all sorts of cool stuff in there. People sharing data, people sharing projects, people helping answering questions for each other. It's a good place to be a part of. But there's also the education component. We're going to do a little bit of education tonight, but there's also like literal guest talks from great researchers or companies who develop things in the field that are awesome to check out that different chapters do. Since we're in this kind of online world right now, definitely check out some of the other NeuroTechX chapters, see if they have speaker events that you could drop in on digitally or whatever. And then finally, the innovation component. Obviously, community and education themselves can inspire innovation, but NeuroTechX really tries to push forth with their hack nights and other types of events, people really taking part in innovation and not just exploring innovation that's happening, but contributing to it. And those three pillars, I think, are what make NeuroTechX a strong community for people to work within. Here's an awesome chart showing where some of the different chapters are. You can see that they have 16,000 community members, which is really cool. Of course, spread throughout the world. There are some places that don't have chapters yet. If you're from somewhere that doesn't have a local chapter, get in touch with Brian, get in touch with Mohit here. They can help get you set up on setting up a chapter for your local area. And with that, we are going to jump into the Buzz and Review event. As I mentioned, if you have questions, feel free to throw them out in the chat. I'll try to look at them and answer as I go through, or some of my other co-presenters will do the same. And so we're going to start with the big trends of 2020. So what we're going to talk about in this section is primarily some of the kind of like big, intriguing events, companies, or certain types of ideas that had a lot of traction this year. And then look at where they're going and what they've done. So the first company we're going to talk about, there we go, if my mouse works, is Kernel. I think Kernel's a really kind of popular company in the neurotech space. Their non-invasive approach is obviously really appealing, even though, I mean, when they first launched, they were actually an invasive company. In fact, Brian Johnson originally worked with BlackRock Microsystems on some of the first kind of ideas behind Kernel before he pivoted and kind of went over to the non-invasive model. But Kernel had a really great year this year. Obviously, their funding raise was solid, even though a fair amount of that was from Brian Johnson himself. Helps when you can have that capital to inject into your own companies. But more specifically, I think, was really their Hello Humanity announcement. For those of you who haven't seen it, they have a webpage. I'm not sure if it's still up, but it at least was called Hello Humanity. And it was kind of an introduction of both their flux and flow concepts, as well as their neuroscience as a service model. So Kernel basically announced two primary devices they've been working on the last couple of years, flux and flow, in that announcement. Flux is basically a magnetometer. So it's taking the normal like meg workflow and making it a lot smaller. It's a wearable one. So normally these meg stations have these really big head things that are connected to a machine, and the magnets are super cooled. They're called squids. But now with this optically pumped mag stuff, they can actually really shrink this size. And I won't get too much into how the optically pumped aspect of it works. But effectively, you're shining a laser through some gas and looking at how that gas changes in response to the magnetic environment that the magnetic field's being caused by your brain, effectively. Flow is their blood sensing one. So this is using infrared to look at blood concentration in different parts of the brain, and it's a different way of looking at neural activity. And both of these devices are wearable and portable, and Kernel's starting to integrate them with other therapies and other technologies such as VR, as you can see here in their November announcement, to kind of really bring this technology into other domains. But one of the big things they kind of pitched was this neuroscience as a service model, which is effectively a form of contract engineering, or I should say contract research, where you can pay Kernel to execute a certain type of neuroscience research experiment for you. So they'll use their equipment, they'll help do the recruiting, and they'll get people on site to their very, very cool lab space to perform some of this neuroscience research. And finally, Kernel announced in December that they had chosen basically some of the first labs that get to, I guess, pilot. So their first shipment of these headsets. So a few academic and industry groups are actually going to be the first people to receive Kernel headsets this year. And I'm excited to hear what that looks like. Another big company this year that had a bunch of cool announcements is Synchron. So Synchron makes a device called the Stentrode. And the Stentrode, as you can see in this picture here, is a device that can slip through your bloodstream. So it's an endovascular device and basically expand and deploy. And this mesh is basically covered in electrode contacts, and those contacts integrate into the blood vessel. So blood continues moving through the blood vessel, and the contacts are just kind of embedded in the wall of it. And this is a really awesome concept because it handles one of the main concerns for high-end brain-computer interfacing, or kind of high-throughput invasive brain-computer interfacing, which is that it reduces the total like invasive procedure. Navigating through blood is much simpler and much easier to do in some ways than brain surgery itself. So it's an easy way to deliver the device to where you need to. And Synchron's actually targeting first movement disorders. So they are delivering the device to the motor cortex and starting to explore using this as a motor brain-computer interface or motor prosthetic. So in this case, it would challenge devices like the Utah Array, as well as other kind of like people competing in this space, such as Neuralink and Paradromics. And one of the cool things that they announced this year was a breakthrough device designation from the FDA. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the regulatory section later and kind of what that means. Basically, it's a fast track to release of their device commercially, as well as the results of their first in-human study. So if you haven't read that one, you should definitely interact with it, read it, because it's really cool to hear kind of what exactly it is that this can do. One of the other cool things about this company that I like to talk about, because I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah, is that the company developing the electronics in this device actually is also from Utah. They're called Ripple Neuro, and they were just allowed to release that news to the public. So Ripple Neuroscience is actually creating the implantable stimulation components of this device that connect to this electrode for Synchron's brain-computer interface stuff. And they actually announced that for their first time at the North American, or the Western North America NeuroTechX event last week. Some of the other trends I want to talk about, since it's a big one and it's really interesting to people, is the prosthetics kind of race. We went from having pretty basic movable prosthetics over the course of the last 15 to 20 years to having these really kind of like many options for advanced neuroprosthetics, or I would say myoprosthetics, devices that measure muscle activity to control finger movement or wrist movement. There's a few different ones that I want to talk about here. One of the first ones is the regenerative peripheral nerve interface, or RPNI, developed by the University of Michigan. RPNI is something that I actually saw for the first time at a talk at North American Neuromodulation Society last year. And the concept's actually pretty simple, even though it's really innovative. Basically, it's hard to measure activity from nerves. You have to put in invasive electrodes and really kind of like clamp them down, and it's hard to read each of the fascicles correctly. And overall, it's generally difficult to receive those signals because they're low amplitude and they're noisy. And this RPNI project says, let's solve that by creating a bioamplifier. Let's just wire one of these nerves up to a little piece of extracted muscle tissue, and we'll just measure the myoelectric activity from that muscle. And then it's way easier to see intensity of the nerve. It's easier to measure when it's firing. And we can use that to basically map to another device, like a neuroprosthetic. And in fact, this is kind of similar to what Johnny Matheny, here shown in the top right picture, has actually done. Is the researchers that helped develop that interface basically took the nerves that would normally wire his lower arm, and they wired them to kind of a segmented portion of his bicep muscle. And now different portions of his bicep can control different functions of the arm. And through some neuroplasticity as well, he's become more and more adept at controlling those pieces individually. Kind of similar to that, there was a cool story this year about a guy who was not impressed with some of the digital prosthetics that were available and made a mechanical one for himself. He actually posted that on Reddit. So that was kind of a cool story to see pop up. Another arm that has come out is the Atom Touch. So the Atom Touch is based on similar technology, though it's completely non-invasive. It doesn't require any sort of like pre-surgery like Johnny Matheny's arm there does. It's non-invasive and attaches, but uses muscle activity to control the arm. And then finally, the Tesla suit glove, even though it's not strictly a neuroprosthetic, it's really cool and is kind of related to prosthetics. It's an interface designed to basically enhance virtual reality experiences. And so you can see it there in the bottom left. It has some controls to, I guess, put resistance on your fingers, for example, when touching like virtual reality objects. And also it can do really fine control of your fingers while you're doing certain other movements. And so it can kind of augment your movement. And so it can be used both as a virtual reality extender, but also as like a trainer to train like fine muscle control and movements. So you could imagine, for example, like learning guitar, playing violin, this thing could kind of help teach you how to like hold your hand and how to move yourself. So it obviously has aspects not just in virtual reality and gaming, which would be really cool, but also in these kind of physical rehabilitation and training aspects. So an interesting one, definitely. So beyond some of those kind of like big announcements from companies this year, there's also a whole bunch of cool research that's been happening in the field. One of the first ones that I'm going to talk about is tattoo electrodes. I won't go too much into exactly how these work, but these are temporary tattoo electrodes. Basically, you can end up removing them later by running a current through them. But they basically allow actual acquisition of EEG and MEG, or they're compatible with MEG, using a tattooed interface. And so for any of you who've ever had to put on like all the wet EEG electrodes, this obviously is an improvement over that if you can convince, I guess, your subjects or participants to be tattooed temporarily. But it also makes it a pretty good alternative to competitor technologies such as what the VIS Center is developing in Geneva, which is something called the Epios system. It basically is a system that's implanted under the skin and does long-term EEG. It seems like this tattoo technology could be used in a similar capacity for long-term take-home monitoring that isn't quite as invasive. So we'll see which of those ones kind of wins out. Somewhat similar to the tattooed electrodes is the idea of flexible, drawable electronics. So we've seen some devices, for example, already, including Tesla suit and including the tattoo electrodes, where we're basically trying to get something that's minimally present, but has these built-in electronics and sensors. And sometimes we want to sense positions of people's hands or strain or stretch. Sometimes we want to measure electrophysiological signals such as skin conductance, or look at more specifically something like EEG or EMG. And so these drawn on skin electronics could allow those types of technologies to be able to take off. So you can imagine it'd be easier if you could create this kind of like a circuit on your skin and then just maybe tape on a simple wire to an external computer or something just to acquire from it. Quite a bit less invasive than wearing gloves or wearing suits or whatever it is we use to measure these types of same signals. This one is also a cool project. This was done at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. This is a blindness restoration project. I won't get too much into some of the companies behind it because it's a little bit secret, I think, still. But effectively, the Baylor College of Medicine has a research group that has been working on advancing visual prosthetics for a long time now. And they've done it through several different ways. At first, they were doing testing in patients who came in for epilepsy resection. And so those patients would actually volunteer to also have their electrodes be used to play around. That's not a very formal way to put it, but play around with stimulation routines used in the visual cortex. So if anybody had epilepsy and had electrodes already placed in the visual cortex, they would ask for permission to see if they could test those out. And they've kind of advanced that technology and advanced their stimulation routines. So to give a little bit more background on it, effectively, what the way that it's implemented is there's a camera that picks up the visual field, and our visual cortex is approximately structured so that it actually physically maps the visual field in front of us. So something that appears on this part of our vision might appear in a specific place in our visual cortex, and something right next to it is next to it on our visual cortex. And that's actually super useful because it allows scientists to basically draw stimulation patterns over the visual cortex to create shapes. And obviously it's a little bit more complicated than that because different electrodes have different kind of connectivity to the brain and different impedance and deliver charge differently. And so they have to kind of tune the electrodes to make sure they're getting a consistent phosphene response or virtual light response. But they can go ahead and draw shapes into the visual cortex of patients. And one of the things they're really concerned about is that the patient's brains would process these as like really discrete, just like separate stimulations. But they're actually seeing that this is early enough in the visual processing chain that they can put those kind of drawn stimulations together and create shapes and letters and edges out of them, which means that this could actually be used to help blind people be able to read non-braille text, for example, or be able to navigate their local environment by scanning the edges of objects. And as these interfaces improve in channel count, they'll be able to steer stimulation better and get finer and finer resolution, leading to higher and higher resolution kind of digital stimulation of the visual cortex. Of course, not everything just happens in the brain. A lot of our nervous system is in the peripheral nerves. And there's a few different studies this year that came out towards peripheral nerve use, which I think are exciting and interesting. The first one may not sound super exciting to some people. The University of Pittsburgh has basically repurposed some spinal cord stimulators to be able to restore touch sensation. So normally spinal cord stimulators are used to block nerve impulses. They're used to control pain. And so they block pain signals from reaching the brain. That's at least one of the most common uses of a spinal cord stimulator. But in this case, they've repurposed these to actually stimulate sensations of feeling or touch, because ultimately all of these signals feed their way from our fingertips or from our hands up to our brain. So somewhere in our spinal cord, you can find those nerves that communicate the touch signal for different parts of our hands or arms or limbs. And so they were able to repurpose that technology and use it in this new way. And I actually think that's super exciting, because one of the big problems that neurotech as an industry has is this kind of constant reinvention of the wheel. People are constantly making brand new devices to do something that's very similar to a device that already exists out there. And this is partially because the field is so new. So many new devices are being developed all the time. It's hard to tell which one is best for which application. But I'm kind of proud of these Pittsburgh researchers for identifying that these existing devices that are already on the market can be used in this really new and exciting way. Similarly, one of the trends that we're seeing in neurotechnology in general is, I would call it optimization. So taking a spinal cord stimulator and finding the neuron that's responsible for touch, for example, could be kind of hard. You sit there and test every single neuron. Maybe you get the spinal cord stimulator close to the one that you need, but it's also stimulating some others. And it's kind of hard to tell exactly where you are and what you're doing and optimizing the therapy. And what these people at EPFL and Lausanne did is, so this is Gregor Cortine's group, is they found a way to genetically identify or mark, it was actually an RNA, so I guess it's like a protein or RNA identification, which neurons are going to be responsible for mobility in the spinal cord. And so they were able to take these paralyzed mice or rodents and determine which neurons to stimulate to restore mobility most effectively. This is like an awesome kind of application of optimization for spinal cord restoration. And the last kind of big research one that I want to talk to you about is Monash. So Monash has a center, a multidisciplinary center, but they specifically focus on hearing and vision restoration. And they've been so far up to this point running research in sheep, showing kind of the same thing as the Baylor group, that stimulation of the visual cortex can lead to vision restoration. And so Monash is now working on the next stage of that device, taking these implanted microelectrodes and using them in human clinical trials for the first time. So they recently got approval to take this device forth for clinical trials. And it's smartphone powered. So it's kind of like communication of the camera and stimulation signals through a smartphone to tell the implant what else to stimulate in the visual cortex, which is pretty cool. So the very last thing I'm going to talk to you about are regulatory approvals. And before I jump into this, I just want to explain some terminology. So I think there's a lot of regulatory terminology thrown around in the news that I think isn't explained well. And I just want to take the time to make sure that we understand those terms before we go through this one. So one of the ones that we've talked about so far is the breakthrough device designation from the FDA. So breakthrough device designation is not an approval to sell a device or to market it. It doesn't mean it's safe for patients. It doesn't mean it can be used effectively. Breakthrough device designation is basically the FDA saying, you've shown us enough evidence that your device could be a better therapy for patients, that it would be an improvement over existing therapies. And therefore, we want to help make sure that's on market quickly so that patients have better treatment options available. And the way the FDA is going to help you do that is we're going to cut all of our kind of like review times in half. So if normally you send us a document and it takes us 90 days to review it, now we only take 45 days. That's what the breakthrough device designation is. And oftentimes companies get it very early in their development because the FDA can also help the companies develop devices to meet clinical trial demands and stuff better. And so normally a breakthrough device designation will occur just after a company's first small clinical trial, like their feasibility trial. Other terms you might hear is a 510K. 510K does mean the device is ready to be sold. It's on market. Basically, it's an indication that a device is similar enough to another device on the market that it also can be sold because it's likely to be safe. And then the other two terms you'll hear are FDA approval and clearance. I won't explain the difference between both of those because they're so similar. But basically, these also mean a device is ready to be sold, that it's on market. And these terms are typically reserved for class 3 or basically new devices to the market that have high risk or have high invasiveness. Or use brand new technologies that the FDA doesn't fully understand yet. So those are kind of those designations. Separately in Europe, you have CE mark. This is typically done a little bit earlier than FDA clearance or approval. CE mark is for approval in Europe, as you know, and we'll see a couple companies with that today as well. So the first company I want to talk about is NeuroTechX. They recently got the FDA green light to this is an IDE approval, so this is for a clinical trial, basically. They got approval to do at-home depression treatments. As somebody who has suffered from depression in the past pretty significantly, this is obviously an exciting thing for me. This allows patients to take devices home and undergo depression therapy remotely using a take-home stimulator and remote therapy, which is obviously awesome for the COVID era, but also in general, for making devices like this more accessible to patients. We also saw the approval of the first clinical video game this year. This company called Akili made a video game for children with ADHD. They got actual clearance for it. So this is the first prescription treatment delivered through a video game. It helps with ADHD and attention disorders and helps improve attentional control in children and, I guess, adults. Another big piece of news this year is Medtronic. This actually kind of, I think, covers one big trend, which we'll see, which is that the big DBS companies, Medtronic, Abbott, Boston Scientific, all pushed out their own big updates this year related to making DBS more advanced and more accessible to patients. So the first one of these is the Percept. So Medtronic added basically normal DBS devices are just implanted and they're like pacemakers. They stimulate regularly into the brain to help with movement disorders like Parkinson's or other disorders like OCD, but they don't read anything from the brain. They're kind of time to stimulate. And this both optimizes the treatment, it makes it better and more effective, but it can also be used to optimize the treatment to make the device last longer. So you're not stimulating when you don't need to, for example, and now the battery lasts longer. So this sensing is going to help in a lot of different ways. And I'm excited to see how researchers actually use it to determine other treatments and learn more about the brain. We also saw approval of Abbott's. So I just mentioned that Abbott, Boston Scientific, and Medtronic put out some big announcements. Abbott got approval of their iOS compatible Neurosphere. So I think this makes it the first just on smartphone approved control of an invasive brain implant, which I think means they beat Neuralink to the pace, getting their whatever iPhone thing up and running. So now you can use your iPhone to control your or interact with your Abbott DBS devices. And Brainwaves also got an FDA clearance this year. This is for a TMS system or transcranial magnetic stimulation system, and this is to help with addiction. So this is a kind of common method for companies to do. They get approval for one indication using their TMS system, for example, and then they get approval for additional indications in the future. And they kind of, now the device has already been distributed, it's in hospitals, it's in clinics, and now they can get a new indication and the device is immediately available and distributed and ready for people to receive that treatment. which is really exciting. And that's why they're able to potentially get a full US market release in early 2021. Obviously, this one is near and dear to my heart, being from Utah and working with Utah Ray for so many years. In fact, I have a Utah Ray on my desk, sitting right here. The University of Utah got FDA approval to initiate a clinical trial or an investigational device exemption to take home the Luke arm, arguably one of the most advanced prosthetic arms in the world, using the Utah slant array. So the Utah slant array is put into a peripheral nerve to acquire from the different nerve fascicles and allow finer control, basically, over the different degrees of freedom of the arm. So this is kind of an unusual one. It's not actually a specific company behind this, even though Ripple and Blackrock Microsystems both contributed to the haptics program, as well as many other companies. But it's actually for the university itself, or for the researchers there doing an academic clinical trial. This one is also close to me. Since my company is also working on Alzheimer's, it's awesome to see other companies who are making headway there. So NeuroEM is a company that got breakthrough designation status this year after their first clinical trial for a non-invasive stim device that potentially reverses Alzheimer's disease. So in rodents, they showed that this broke down amyloid beta plaques, not just in the extracellular space, but also inside of cells, which traditional pharmaceutical treatments don't reach. And they saw a reversal of symptoms in those mice, and they're seeing a reversal of symptoms in the human patients that used it during the clinical trial as well. So if this really goes forth and is effective in the large clinical trial, this would be our first big Alzheimer's device that is really truly effective at the kind of influencing the course of Alzheimer's disease. And the last one that I'll talk about, at least on slides, is the high resolution scanner from GE. So GE got their first 510 clearance of the 7 Tesla MRI scanner, which should let researchers see much higher detail and level of structural detail for kind of microanatomy and vasculature in the brain and in other places. The MRI scanners are used for many reasons, which should hopefully advance kind of research capabilities and targeting capabilities, as well as kind of everything that relies on brain imaging. So definitely an exciting step there for GE. And I guess the last kind of thing that I'll mention are another kind of big regulatory announcement this last year was the Neuralink announcement. They got their breakthrough device designation this year. So that means they have some kind of expedited help from the FDA. And my friend's company, Spark Biomedical, also got their FDA clearance this year, or rather it was a 510K, I think, for the approval of their Sparrow system, which helps with opioid withdrawal. So it's a neurostimulation system to help with opioid withdrawal. It's very minimally invasive. It stimulates, I think it's non-invasive actually. It stimulates a nerve near the ear and helps with opioid withdrawal symptoms in babies actually who are born addicted to opioids. So that covers my sections, and I'm going to pass it to Mark and then Abby to handle the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Nick. I had a question from Mario. What is the approach, technology-wise, for reversing Alzheimer's memory loss? Do you have some input for that?
Yeah. So it's effectively, I think it's probably best categorized as temporal interference because it's able to use interfering electrical fields to target deep brain structures. So they're able to deliver charge to deeper structures to dissolve some of those plaques. I don't know enough about the science behind it because, as somebody has pointed out before, it's not like they're electrically like dissociating proteins or like burning away plaques, because then you'd just be like tearing apart the brain. So I don't know if even they fully understand the mechanisms behind some of it, to be honest. But a lot of treatments are born that way. They're kind of just derived empirically, and we find out they work. In the pilot study, they had 6 patients, and 5 of them were good responders, and 1 of them was a moderate responder. And so pretty solid success rate for a small trial, especially without kind of like further optimizing the device. So I think things look positive. Yeah, I'm excited for it.
Cool. So I'm going to be continuing the presentation, and my colleague in Zurich, Abby Holland, is also going to be jumping in for a panelist discussion. And we also have Plato Science coming to give a little talk. I came from the lab, so actually I still have my ambo on my head, but can't remove it at the moment. We were doing a few brain measurements today. So I'm going to continue with the rest of the talk. Excellent. Here we go. If I remember how to go full screen. Awesome. Present, of course, most obvious answer. So I work at NeuroTechnologies in Zurich, and that's why I'm presenting about tech innovations, because I'm working primarily on neurotechnology and consumer-focused product innovations. And on the side of neurotech with regards to consumer products, moving away from medical, things are getting super exciting in 2020 and 2021. For those of you who are into brain-computer interfaces that you can just like put on the top of your head, where you have dry electrodes, you don't need to put on wet electrodes or anything like that. There's more and more devices coming on the market almost, I wouldn't say every month, but almost every quarter or every half year. For example, the Notion by Neurosity, they just started shipping their Notion 2, I think just before the year started. We got it, I think around November. And it's really cool because you can basically just put it on your head, connect to their web console, and start reading your own brainwaves. If you want something, and it's also affordable. I mean, it's like about $1,000 for their dev kit, and I think even now it's maybe a bit cheaper. I think their latest batch was sold out, but I'm sure they're going to be releasing another one in the coming year. And the cool thing about these devices is that they're much more plug and play than they used to be. And so if you need to just put them on your head, fire up the software, you can start doing measurements, you can start looking at alpha waves, you can start looking at ASSR, setting up your own experiments, and also using them to some extent with mobility, so you can really start to take EEG outside of the laboratory. Also, if you're following some of the news, OpenBCI just announced their partnership with Valve, which is super interesting. As you might know, Valve is a game design company, and they also produce VR hardware. OpenBCI produces brain-computer interface hardware. So they're actually fusing the two of these together in their Galea development kit. And that's going to be shipping sometime in 2021. So like just be on the channels for OpenBCI. Because when we start to integrate virtual reality together with brain-computer interface technology and activity monitoring, we really start to open up this idea for adaptive gaming, and also putting users into new environments and testing how those environments are affecting the brain in a very intuitive way. At the same time, you have companies like G-Tech, which are releasing brain-computer interfaces that are a bit more expensive, but they're allowing us to do up to, I think, 1,024 channels with their new electrodes. You kind of need to shave your head, as far as I know, which I do occasionally for BCI research. So it's really a deep user product, but I know in this demo, they were integrating with an artist where she was creating a 3D printed dress and essentially a fashion garment, which is modifying itself with her brainwaves. So it's very cool. So with these different devices, we go from relatively simple headbands to more complex pseudo caps to extremely complex higher resolution devices. So it's getting easier and easier to get into this field and develop the type of product and technology that you want to develop for the world. On the other hand, we were looking at things like paradomics, where they're creating, I mean, this is really interesting. They're working with a sheep cortex with 30,000 electrode channels. And as you might, if you've looked at any sort of BCI that you can wear, you know, you're basically 32 channels at the most. When you start to get into 64 or 128 channels, it gets to be a bit cumbersome to work with in the lab. And so here they're developing a system where you go up to 30,000. So you can imagine that when you're even looking at just part of the brain with such a high resolution, it really opens up all of these use cases that just aren't really feasible if we're using surface or scalp EEG. Also, probably one of the biggest announcements, also for like general population, if we think about people who are outside of neurotech, Elon Musk and the Neuralink announcement where they were demoing their implant with a pig, and essentially the pig was, we're basically seeing how when a pig is smelling different things, we see the reaction in the brain. And I think this is a relatively interesting demo in that it shows that you could do this in real time. And I don't know what the use case is for it at the moment, but it shows that if we can get that data and then we can apply AI algorithms to it or machine learning algorithms, as long as we can have a continuous stream of data using a very high resolution system like this, we could potentially open up a lot of different applications. And when it's a small device, which can be relatively easily implanted, it's just opening up a whole new horizon for neurofeedback and neurotechnology. And when you think about Neuralink, you know, the key isn't necessarily that they're creating this hardware device, but that they're creating the implantation method together with the hardware device. You know, if you really look at their patents, it's about how to make this as accessible as possible, not just the fact that you're able to put 1,024 channels more or less directly on the brain. And another cool thing coming out of UCLA was a high-density optical topography. So there's different ways to do brain imaging, of course. We can do things like try to see where the oxygenation level is in the brain using FNIRS. And we can do things like the biopotential using EEG. But starting to have some of these systems which are much more accessible and deployable to a different range of people, you know, even down to babies, not just to adults in the lab. It's opening up this window into the developmental world, which we haven't really been able to investigate too in-depthly yet. So I'm really excited at the way that these technologies are coming down in cost, and that just opens up all these new application areas. However, as someone who works at a startup company, and there are many other neurotech companies looking for funding, it's really interesting to see where that funding is going, because it actually shows, I would say, a bit of the confidence that investors are starting to have in neurotech. So on the one hand, in February, we had, with the crowdfunding, Make 100 was essentially a create your own brain interface, also like a very hacker-centered development kit. They brought in like 15,000 euros to help bring their project to life. And so it shows that there's a lot of drive also from the community to fund these projects and bring them into the market. Brick Bionics, it's an impulse neurocontroller for PC gaming. I actually saw this first at a neurotech event, I think about half a year ago. And so essentially what they're doing is looking at the way where the neuro impulse can work together with your muscle impulses to essentially improve the way that you can interact with a game. So you can essentially interact faster than you would with a normal push button interface. And yeah, actually very soon after I heard about NeuroTechX, they were launching, they got 306 backers, so they're bringing in a cool amount of funding. And also Happy brought in over $500,000, which when you consider that, there are a lot of startup projects which go to funding platforms like a Kickstarter. And when you can bring in a lot of money, it really shows that people are validating the need and the desire for these types of products in the marketplace. And when investors see that, then they're more, it's a way to show that there's validation so that they can invest their money and then help to kickstart the projects to a larger extent. Also, Rune Labs, doing brain imaging and data aggregation in the course of clinical studies or care. Now, why is this interesting? When we look at neuroscience and technology, there's usually silos based around people who can acquire the data. And what we're going to start to see over the next 5 years, especially, is that the ability to acquire data and then plug in directly to platforms for doing things like biomarker analysis, and then having an API so you can feed that information back into your application is just going to increase, and at some point start to explode. Because when you take neuroscience out of the lab, you can really open up the applications for it for humanity and society in general. And when you combine this with things like neuromodulation or deep brain stimulation or transmagnetic stimulation, you really start to go in towards some of these applications like major depressive disorder. Previously in another startup, we were working on how to predict what medication to give to MDD patients. And what we saw is that there's possibilities of things like TMS, but it's at such a high cost that it's really difficult to justify in the earlier stages of treatment. So if we can bring down the cost of this and understand which patients are going to respond best to TMS treatments, we can really start to optimize and expand and improve how mental health is treated in that sector. And also in the EGI product portfolio, electrogeodesics, they had a high density EEG complement to TMS. And so this is super interesting because in many cases, when I've looked at TMS in the past, you would have a TMS operator and they would perform the TMS therapy, but there wouldn't necessarily be a direct feedback on what was happening in the patient's brain during that time. And so I've always felt that even though there was clinical validation for some of these treatments, there wasn't this deeper understanding of the direct effect that that treatment is having on that patient beyond just doing patient interviews. So now being able to have feedback from EEG together with TMS, you're able to close this loop and really begin to have the foundation for understanding how effective this treatment is going to be for individual patients. Because when you talk about mental health, I mean, the really exciting thing is that we can go more towards individualization of treatments. When we're only using medications and trying to do it over a very broad population, it can be much more difficult to really address individual patients' needs. And we see with the major depressive disorder and depression in general is becoming, I believe, the second leading cause of disability, at least when I was researching this 2 years ago. And with things like COVID, it's just increasing. So having these new technologies come into the market at this time is really exciting, not just from a technology perspective, but just for society in general. Then we have NeuroValves. Their portfolio is containing devices for weight loss and insomnia. And these are things which, for many people, can be debilitating to a certain extent. For other people, it might just be a slight inconvenience in life or something that they want to optimize. But what's really great is that with these devices being able to acquire $5 million in a funding round, we can start to address these different problems in society, which might be, one of the things that we're sometimes criticized about in the tech industry is that we're developing solutions like a Facebook, which is, let's say, solving some need, but it's only in a very broad spectrum of society. And if Facebook went down tomorrow, many people would be happy. For some people, it wouldn't matter at all. And why aren't we using our knowledge and technology to solve really more critical problems in society? And with neurotech and the decrease in cost of sensors, cost of power to do processing, it just opens up all these use cases, which we really couldn't address 5 and definitely not 10 years ago. So as a neurotechnologist, I think it's really interesting, if you're getting into this field, to think about some problem you can solve, even if it's in a narrower focus, and then go after it, because the need is there for a lot of people. Also, in the neo development therapeutics, this idea of smart neurostimulation and really creating a closed loop, as we talked about before with TMS, to understanding what the effect of neurostimulation is having on the body is just, I think, maybe over the next 10 years, I think it could be one of the most critical things that comes out of neurotech and neuroscience in general when we're talking about, applying this to a broader part of the population. Because it's starting to open up something between what we now consider or have considered to be science fiction and medicine. And the fact that that some of these companies are able to get that funding, it shows that the investors have, that their idea has really been validated to the point where it makes sense to give them funding. And just being part of that is a very exciting thing to be doing with my life right now. We've also seen that Astellix is acquiring IOTA, in that the R&D agreement between IOTA and Astellas for activities associated with IOTA's ultrasonic powered bioelectric devices coming out. I've worked previously also with smart catheters, where we were creating very small flow sensors which would go into the body to measure blood flow velocity. And the fact that we can take these microelectronics for ultrasound and now bring them together with wireless communications into a neurotech application is super interesting, because we're creating these implantable medical devices, which, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the general population would have considered this to really be science fiction. So I'm really interested to see what's going to happen with the miniaturization of devices that we can really implant together with our growing understanding of biology and physiology through these new imaging technologies. And one of the things that we didn't talk too much about before with NeuroTechX is the community outreach and the way that there are different competitions. So actually, one of the first ways I learned about NeuroTechX was through the Neureka Epilepsy Challenge, where they opened up let's say the access to data, where a lot of people could compete. They could download the data set, which included epilepsy for people who were sleeping. And then people could train their own deep learning algorithms and understand how they could use machine learning methods to predict epilepsy from the training data. This was brought about with Novel Neurotech, really cool company as well. And it was a really great way to open up and in a way democratize this idea of deep learning and neurotechnology. So I know a lot of people came into the program learning about neurotech this way. It was also a way to apply a lot of the knowledge that we've been learning about with artificial intelligence to a really cool community-sourced need. So if you want to check it out, all the details and all the archives are on the neurotechchallenge.com. And if you want to download the data set yourself, just be advised that 67 gigabytes, and on my internet connection, I think I had my computer running for like 2 days just to download the data set. And as we're going forward, some of the cool apps that are being built with neurosensory devices. The Buzz Arduino air control sensor by Chris Bartley. I really love these ideas because the democratization of hardware is now following what we've seen with software. You can very easily pull together a hardware device using Arduinos, using an ESP32 controller, and you can build a lot of these technology solutions really in your basement or your garage or your apartment. And with the way that we can now commercialize a lot of hardware designs, it's just becoming so much easier to go from like technology idea and proof of concept to prototype and then small scale production within a short amount of time, and also at a decreasing cost. And some of the other cool congratulations are the Open Challenge, first place going to McGill Neurotech as part of the NeuroTechX Student Club awards competition. I'd also like to thank Muse and OpenBCI for underwriting and being part of supporting neurotech, because as some of the oldest companies in neurotechnology, they really create a lot of the foundation for other companies such as Edun and Neurosity to build their solutions and identify customers with their solutions in mind. So if you're also in the school, look at neurotech clubs. The student clubs are a great way to bring together and form foundations in universities, and then coordinate and compete between one another going forward. Also, it's a great way to learn about neurotech. So one of the things I've always loved about NeuroTechX is that there's a great access to knowledge. And through the student clubs and competition and Git repositories, you can very easily jump in and onboard yourself into neurotech and start to work with other people in the field. Also, BitBrain, they've been offering grants up to $150K, including equipment, and also providing additional research tools with different software tools and psychology analysis. BitBrain is also one of these technology companies where they're providing a really high-level device which allows you to just create an insane amount of data than was ever really possible or accessible outside of a laboratory environment. And we're also seeing this from companies like Kernel, where they were also offering essentially low-cost or no-cost development kits. As long as you had a great solution, you could execute on that solution. OpenBCI also has a lot of the similar initiatives. So if you're at a stage where you understand what you want to do with neurotech, but you don't quite have all the infrastructure in mind, realize that there's a lot of programs that are out there to help you get over that technology hump and start to develop the solutions that basically the world needs in society. Also, being in Zurich, we're close to the ETH, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And there's a great organization throughout the world, and we also have a focus here at ETH called the Stiebelthon, where they essentially do an Olympics together with neuroprosthetics and prosthetic devices. So there's a lot of competitions and challenges based around solving some of these issues where you might have a brain-computer interface working with a neuroprosthetic, where you have to control how the person is interacting with that device and really improve their experience. So some of the cool things are like a wheelchair going over different inclines, creating smart solutions for this. It could also include machine vision, for example, on how the wheelchair is being controlled through an environment. Also including how your body needs to work together with the prosthetic, not just that it's a sort of passive device to help you, but one which is really integrating with your own anatomy and physiology. And as a student competition, this is amazing to get into if you're at that stage. And I believe I'd like to hand things over quickly to Abby Holland from the Zurich chapter. Abby, would you like to take over?
Sure, thanks, Mark. Okay, wonderful. So one other really cool thing that NeuroTechX is doing right now is it's trying to spread out a little bit more into a diversity initiative. So this kind of came about in June when the protests and all these discussions came up in the US. It was just kind of obvious that this needed to be more of a focus area, both within NeuroTechX, but also just in the general field of neurotechnology as a whole. So this is kind of aimed at continuing to democratize neurotechnology as much as possible and building off a lot of the other ideas that NeuroTechX has going. So we have both a committee and a consortium to kind of come up with new ideas as well as to drive them forwards and improve our diverse angle at NeuroTechX. Mark, do you want to go or shall I continue? You're on mute, sorry. A classic.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, Abby, you probably work with EEG notebooks more than I do, but it's probably one of our favorite technologies.
Yeah, I can definitely talk a little bit about EEG notebooks. This is what I spend a lot of my time thinking about it. So EEG notebooks is a fantastic open source resource produced by NeuroTechX and led by some of the strong members of NeuroTechX. I believe I saw Morgan's name on this call. Can you help out with the two a little bit? Shout out. But basically, it's really, really great for psychology experiments and running through some of the go-to EEG experiments. And it's pretty easy to edit and iterate and play around with. So definitely if you're looking to begin some experiments and you're not really sure where to get started or what the experiments entail or kind of how to approach that, this is definitely the one-stop shop that you should start out at.
Ooh. And also talking about Moab, the mother of all benchmarks, I believe. So actually, Abby and I talked about this a little bit in a podcast a little while ago, this idea of that there's a lot of research topics out there where there's a lot of good results seen. I've also seen it in things like depression research and machine learning, where there are results presented, and then basically they can't be reproduced or validated very easily beyond the initial study. And this is one of the initiatives which is working to start changing that. So one of the problems that we have is you might not know how the data was pre-processed, you might not have access to that data, and there might not be like a very clear evaluation of different algorithms for, you know, what's really the best way to address or analyze a particular data set from a research study. And so this is a way to start standardizing and creating benchmarks for our BCI research. And this is really amazing because if we can agree on certain standards for how different tests are run and how they're analyzed, then we can really start to more collaboratively bring together an understanding of what's happening with different topics in neuroscience and brain-computer interface design. So also go check that out. And if you're developing different BCI analysis techniques, this is like a great place to get into it. Also, quick shout out to the content laboratory. So one of the, I would say, backbones of NeuroTechX is the content that's being created and put out week to week, month to month. It's really become an organization which is creating this nexus for how to jump into neurotech. And I think we'll be able to look back on this, 5, 10 years from now as a way where neurotech and neuroscience was really made more accessible to the rest of the world.
Democratizing.
And part of this are the new publications coming out, Neuralink and Beyond, Emerging Issues in Neurotechnology from Simon. Netchal is doing Arriving Somewhere But Not Here. Firas from Barcelona, really cool guy. Neurotechnology and Architecture, which for me was opening up a new horizon because I started talking to Firas about neurotech and how he's applying it to architecture and design. And it really underpinned to me the ways that neurotech can really influence different facets of society and not just be something for neurotech researchers in the lab. So I'm really interested to see what's going to be coming out in 2021. And if you're interested in producing content, I would say get in contact with them because I'm sure they'd be looking for more help and brains to help them. Also, looking a little bit at our roadmap for 2021. In 2020, we also started out with a Buzz and Review event. That was the first event. I was not a part of it. I'm believing Abby actually was. I only got into this around, no, she wasn't. I only got into this around June of 2020, and it's been a great trip. I learned a lot at the NeuroTech Gaming event in July, and just like the integration with the society, also across the globe, has just been getting better and better every month. So as we have this expansion of events, as Nick was talking about earlier, it's going to be great to see how we can just create this neurotech community and use it to the benefit of all people. So I think now we're going to jump into our, is Baldur here?
Yes, I am. Was muted. Can you hear me, Mark?
Hi. So I'd like to introduce Plato Science. Also creating one of the very cool neurotech devices that I see on the internet and see as a marker for what we can build towards.
Cool.
And I believe you can take over control. Very happy to have you here.
Let's see, I'm just getting things up here. I'm stealing your screen, Mark. So can you guys see my presentation? Okay, perfect. So first of all, I love being part of NeuroTechX events because it's covering all the stuff that I find so interesting. And to me, all these things, the regulatory, the new technologies, the therapeutic implications, all these things have been the key motivation for us to launch Play-Doh Science to begin with. My name is Baldur, and I founded Play-Doh Science 5 years ago together with a neurobiologist. I'm from engineering myself, and this neurobiologist, Morten, and I, we did our PhDs together, and we looked at two different aspects of creativity. So how can creativity be enhanced? And that inspired us to found our own company. And at Play-Doh Science, we focus on 3 different types of activities. So we play around with neuroimaging technologies, mainly EEG, previously more fMRI, and more recently FNIRS. Then we do cognitive training programs and look at the effects over time, which I definitely find the most interesting part of the work we do is fully acknowledging the fact that our brains are changing all the time and that we can exert more or less control over that process, which leads me to the third part of our business, which is focusing on creating devices that can communicate with the brain, BCIs, as you might call them. And the 4 key technologies in the work we've done, starting from fMRI, more EEG. Now we work mainly with HRV and TDCS, where HRV is our sort of data benchmark for the TDCS work we do. And I'm sure all of you are very familiar with transcranial electrical stimulation, both TDCS, direct current, and TACS, alternating current. And as a lot of other technologies, they have their roots in the military and in clinical context. So everything from pilots, snipers, depression treatment, stroke rehabilitation. And what Morten and I, my co-founder, found a bit limiting with TDCS was the format of it. This is from Wikipedia, quite a common setup for TDCS. And to me, the problem with TDCS is I don't consider it any doubt whatsoever that the technology has an effect on the brain and that it is safe. The question is more exactly what can it be used for most beneficially, and also what are the individual differences and how can we best account for them. And the, to me, biggest barrier towards understanding more about transcranial electrical stimulation technologies has been the physical devices themselves. Because if you have to get people into a lab and strap them up like the guy in the picture with some very expensive lab equipment, then you end up having 10 people studies where you've controlled for every possible thing you can, and you have people doing one session once and you look for microscopic effects. So what we wanted to do was to democratize it and say, let's turn it around and create a device which packaged TDCS and later TACS in a format which is so easy to use that anyone can have access to the technology, but also thereby distributing the science. So instead of bringing people to the lab, we bring the lab to people with a device that they can use at home. And the core of TDCS is super simple. It's basically a power generator that sends an electrical current through the brain, normally to different electrodes, an anode and a cathode. And the very simplified way of understanding it is that in the areas around the anode, you have an increased potential for activity, and in the area around the cathode, you have a decrease in the potential for activity. So this is sort of the very simple idea. The question is more, how does this look on scale? So we developed a product called Play-Doh Work. The first version was launched back in 2016. We've done a lot of iterations, issues like durability, mishandling, ease of use, I'll get back to the app part of it in a little bit. And this is the current design, which is for sale these days in our web shop. And the thought behind Play-Doh Work was to, instead of expecting that people read up on TDCS and learn where to put the electrodes and study the 1020 system and try to read around, you know, ooh, if I'm trying to mimic this or that study, which area, you know, it's not an easy place to start. So what we wanted to do was just take a lot of different type of studies and simplify it into as few electrode placements as possible. So we have 3 electrode placements, F3, F4, and P set on Preconius. And with those 3 placements, you can obviously have 6 programs. We have started with 4 different ones. And again, this is a consumer approach to, you know, how can we best describe a number of studies that are looking at slightly different effects. So the 4 programs we have and offer are Concentrate, Create, Learn, and Rethink, which are then 2 frontal and 2 from F3 to PSET and vice versa programs. We will already next week launch a research project where we launch what we call Program X and Y, where we have 2 other type of electrode activation, and we try to not prime our users to what it is. So we basically ask them to tell us what they experience from the programs and ask them to use it in different contexts. We have about 100 sessions per day, 52,000 sessions so far, 5,000 hours of data. So a lot of very active users. So what we hope is that in thinking a little more bottom up, we might learn some interesting new things that we can then scale up and do more sort of rigorous studies about. The next product we have coming up is a product called Play-Doh Game. This is, as you can see from the cabling, an earlier prototype, and the electrode placements are the same. The application is quite different because it's designed for context where you have a headset on. So everything from esports to professional shooters and pilots are other type of domains where you're like me right now, have a big headset on. So if you're interested in hearing more about Play-Doh Game and learn more when we launch that product, hopefully in April, please sign up on our website /Play-Doh Game. Another benefit with Play-Doh Game is that it's quite suited for fitting with virtual reality. So this is from a test we've done together with a Copenhagen-based virtual reality company called Cora, where we looked at how TDCS can be used to increase the effects of cognitive training in virtual reality, which I find super interesting cross-field, especially now also with OpenBCI moving into VR. I think the combination of EEG, VR, and TES is a very interesting prediction for 2021. 2 other studies we are currently performing. So we do a CSGO study where we are testing beginners in CSGO, a computer game esport, where we see whether we can improve the learning speed using TDCS, and that looks extremely good so far. So that's a very interesting study for us. We also do bigger at-home studies in collaboration with Cambridge Brain Sciences. So I'm sure most of you have been in touch with them one way or another, but that's a great way of doing distributed, very scientific studies with their cognitive benchmarking, which of course is a third party, where we use the Play-Doh Work users at home. And I also want to say 2 or 3 words about the current hype around brain devices. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but I really enjoyed it. It's from the New York Times. It's from August, but it's an opinion about what we guys do and you guys do and all of us are here about. And I think it's quite interesting to see how the rest of the world perceive the idea of both reading and communicating back to the brain, or neuromodulation. And I think that the difference between people's perception of what it is and what it can do and the reality of it is extremely far apart. I keep getting calls from Danish journalists asking me to comment on Neuralink because, you know, now Elon Musk is about to steal your thoughts, and it's sort of, you know, that's really, I think, a challenge for the whole field that we're working in. That I think actually it might scare people off. So I think the general public might think that it's scary stuff when in reality it's very early, all of it, and at best pure therapeutic in the near future. Another trend that I observe with interest is the very commercial parts of neurostimulation devices. I don't know if you guys have seen this. This is from Shark Tank. It's a low cost TDCS, put it on, press a button and hope that something happens type of product. And I personally feel that it's a dangerous venue if we start selling cheap gear that we don't really know exactly what they do and if they work well and what happens over time. And if that gets into the mainstream and too many people have bad experiences, then that can be a big setback for the whole field. And Mark, you showed a selection of 3 other neurostimulation devices, and as you said, I feel that it's every week, not every quarter, but there are definitely a lot of products coming out. And I think my concern about the development is related to the type of technologies used, because some of the technologies are sort of very homemade, or very it's someone just came up with an idea, and it's not because it's been studied for a long time, or it's sort of a validated, and then it becomes a consumer product before it actually has been fully studied in lab context, which I think is quite a big risk, to be honest. And some of these products also use very dubious marketing methods, and I won't say which one, but one of these 3 products have been caught up in quite a big media scandal. If you haven't seen it, their name is now removed after the CEO publicly threatened to sue the guy who wrote this article on Reddit. But if you're interested in sort of drama around dirty marketing of neuromodulation devices, then I can recommend both the article and the chaotic but very interesting Reddit thread that came out of it. And again, I think this is another, unvalidated technology being pushed to people with too hard claims and fake peer-reviewed articles behind it. That's not good for the field. Then a couple of closing comments, other things in our project that I find important. So first of all, to me, the fact that we have an app which is doing continuous monitoring of all the headsets we have in the market and what they do, how they perform, giving us feedback if the headsets are doing anything that they're not supposed to do. I think it's a very important part of our project, and probably the reason why I sleep well at night is because we actually have stats on what our products are up to. I mentioned the program X and Y, so starting now to do some more bottom-up type of feedback from our users. We're also reaching a data size where we can start doing some very interesting analyses on the basic nature of TDCS. So there are a lot of hypotheses, or not even hypotheses, known truths out there. For instance, there's known truth that over a 30-minute neurostimulation session, your resistance will have a continuous fall. And that's not the case. It seems to be a case for certain users, but definitely not for other users. So we have data now to start looking at some of the myths and known truths from neurostimulation. We're also starting to get some really nice data in terms of calibration improvement. So anyone who's been doing EEG or TDCS, TSES know the hassle of getting a sufficient connection, if that's reading or writing, or sending or receiving electrical currents. And I think that's another big data benefit that we have, is that we can really fine tune what are the parameters you use to accept or discard a calibration process. Then we are also building in sham in our app, so placebo control, so our users can choose to be blinded in their own simulations, which is very interesting, but it's also quite challenging because, after all, we also sell a product. So it's a fine balance between being scientific and giving people the product they paid for. We're also working on what we call the Freestyle app, which is a more scientific app where the user can sort of define the exact parameters for the program they use. We have quite some researchers and we have clinics around the world now using our products, and this app will make it easier for them and for students, researchers in universities to use our products for other type of studies, not just using the programs that we have. So utilizing the full potential in the hardware itself. Then, as you might have heard, I don't think Nick mentioned it, there is a new directive coming out in the EU on the 26th of May this year, which will ban all neurostimulation devices unless they have a medical approval. And we are extremely excited for that to happen and really welcome the new directive, because that will hopefully filter out in some of the more home-built products out there. It also makes it, unfortunately, harder for making new products. So our sort of launch pace will probably be slowing down for a little while, but that's, I guess, just the price you pay. Finally, if any of you or any of your students or friends of yours would be interested in working with TDCS, TSES, preferably in combination with other technologies, then reach out to us. We love working with students, so that's very welcome. Happy to provide headsets. Also been talking to Nick actually about doing a sort of headset for students campaign through NeuroTechX, so keep an eye out for that. That was the end of my talk. Ways to get in touch with us. If you would consider to purchase a PlayerWork for yourself, I made a 15% discount code, NeuroTechX15, that you can use in our web shop. And if you want to read more about the work that I've been doing scientifically, there's one article in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience that you can have a look at. And I also have a TEDx talk where I talk about my research a bit more popular science way. So that's all from my end. Any questions or comments? I haven't seen the comment field, so if Mark or someone else will
Yeah, there was.
pitch in.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. Mario had a question. You had a Horizon 2020 project. I was wondering, what were your plans for the outcome of that, or any comments about your partners?
Oh yes, definitely. So we have done we finished it summer 20, and it's about a product called Play-Doh Cure, which is an EEG TDCS TSES product. We have the product, and right now we are preparing it for the new regulations from the 26th of May. So that's right now, it's a regulatory matter. And as soon as we've done with that, we can start the launching of it and so forth. But we're trying. It's a very good question, because the tricky bit to me about medical applications of TDCS is still who administers the products and the whole ecosystem around it. And I think the big challenge is just compliance, because for anyone who's been working with anxiety and depression, getting people to comply with whatever regime you have is the biggest problem. So you can have the best regime in the world or the best product in the world, but if you can't get people to actually use it, then it doesn't matter. And I think that's a problem that we and everyone else with the physical device, you have to prepare and put on and use for half an hour each day for it to have an effect. That's sort of, unless you put that into a context, where one offspring of the Horizon project is a collaboration with a huge brain rehabilitation clinic in the US, who are currently using 100 of our headsets in their rehabilitation procedures. And there it's very close follow-up, and it's paid by insurance companies. So I think that's a typical stage where it's easier to see how it could actually work with compliance, because you have a person who's paid to do a continuous follow-up with each patient to ensure compliance.
Fascinating, thank you. It was really interesting to hear your talk. Abby,
cool, thanks for having me.
Yes. And we will also shout out to Plato Science in the Future on Twitter.
Thank you.
Abby, would you like to take over?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Again, thank you so much for that talk. That was really, really interesting and very enjoyable. Are you comfortable staying on while I ask a few questions?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, wonderful. I just wanted to.
It's 6 o'clock a.m. here in Melbourne, so I have all day, literally.
Okay, awesome. Guess that works out well for us then. Okay, so firstly, this was a really interesting whole discussion, and I'm really glad we kind of got to do such an intense review at once. Obviously, I'd seen the slides beforehand, but it's very interesting to just get hit with all of the information of one go, and really look at how big how important NeuroTechX is, or neurotech in general, is slowly becoming in the field. I feel like there's so many different things emerging and so much research and products. It's really, really exciting to see the exponential increases. So I guess kind of on that, we've discussed a lot about what's happened in the past year and speculating a little bit about going forwards. But I mean, I guess a first general question is, I kind of want to lead the discussion in the direction of what are you guys expecting for this coming year? And now we've kind of looked at the buzz and review for 2020, but into 2021, in terms of consumer products and in terms of research, how close do you guys think we actually are in terms of getting a lot of these products to have FDA approval and to have a lot of these products actually be usable in consumer homes?
Can I go? I think I hate myself for saying this, and I don't like to come across as conservative, but I actually think it's happening a little too fast. I think there are a lot of new products coming, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I believe that all of them are market ready. So the push might be stronger than the interest. And just for our sake, I think one of the things that we have seen is it's actually not easy to sell neurostimulation devices to the general non-hacker audience unless you really push it. So it's sort of it's not a space where products sell themselves in any way. And we have, when you do online marketing, you often end up in situations where you are bidding towards other companies, and we're being outbid so hard by some of these other companies where it's sort of they're spending so much money that you guys won't believe it. Like we couldn't keep up for a day. And I think if you have to do that to sell your product, maybe you're pushing it too hard, and maybe the people who are being pushed at might not end up having a good experience, and then it might actually be damaging for the whole field and anyone who wants to launch products in the next 5 years. So yeah, that's my conservative, unfortunately, take on it.
I love the controversial responses. Mark, do you have anything to add to that or to rebut?
I mean, that's always one of the questions that we have, or maybe one of the fears, is that neurotechnology is also a bit too soon for societal acceptance. And so I'm wondering, I mean, that's a common barrier all the time, because you can't just automatically change, the perception that people have of technology. And we always talk about these like gateway applications, I would say, where you can use the product at a certain level, it adds value to your life, you can feel it, and then you can integrate it into society, into a wider product portfolio. And I'm wondering if, neurostimulation is really at the right point yet. But I think with some of the applications, people are definitely opening up to it.
Yeah, I also adding to it, I think it's still not easy to see exactly where the consumer neurostimulation market is and should be. I think, Mark, you mentioned the anti-craving neuromodulation. And I think, no offense, but the whole losing weight segment, just taking part of that in itself, that's such a sketchy place to go. And if you bring something which is so deeply technological and deeply serious as brain stimulation is, and you say use this to lose weight, and you end up at the same shelf as pills and nutritions and stuff. It's definitely a question of where it has its right. And I think Flow Neuroscience, one of our competitors, and Halo Neuroscience have done it quite well in terms of scoping. So Halo is doing neurostimulation for top athletes. So they basically say, we can give you the last 0.05% gain, which might be enough to take you from bronze to gold. And that's, I think, a fair claim. Flow is focusing on anxiety, depression treatments, but at home and not necessarily with the compliance part. So I think they definitely have that challenge. But I think, again, that's a very fair place to say, there are about 100 different studies now looking at depression and anxiety treatment with TDCS, and it's good. It's at least as good as the most common type of medications you can get. So there's no reason why it shouldn't be available. So I think that's another example of a product.
That's an interesting point, because we were looking at that also for depression. And on the one hand, you can make the case that depression medications are relatively cheap. And for like TMS, for example, when I was looking at it, you were looking at like 16,000 for a treatment session. And and it seems like these two then have to come to the same level where they would actually be used by doctors with their patients. So I was wondering if you have some idea for that acceptance level.
Yeah, it's actually the big barrier. So I completely agree. And the, for me, important difference between the medications and the modulations is the long-term effect. So in theory, you can actually train your way out of a depression using neuromodulation. You cannot do that using chemicals. That's sort of at best making you feel better, but it doesn't, it's not a path out of it. So I think in that sense, the promise of technology is better, but the problem right now is reimbursement categories. So there are none. And the closest you have is the EEG neurofeedback one. A lot of countries do have a reimbursement category for neurofeedback, and we are currently testing whether some countries might accept a neuromodulation in that category, because you can sort of say it is neurofeedback. It's just that the feedback is very active compared to the classical implementation of neurofeedback. But that's the problem, is even if a doctor wanted to use it, he wouldn't get his pay for using it. So then it doesn't really make a big difference. Flow has done something clever in launching in the UK, where in the UK the regulations are a bit different. So you don't need a reimbursement category. If a doctor prescribes something, the doctor will be reimbursed. But that's a very long story. But it's an interesting part of why some products might have a more or less obvious path to market.
I guess sorry, Mark, you can respond.
Oh no, I just wanted to say I'm surprised that I wasn't thinking about that also earlier, because we had a lot of conversations also with heads of clinics in Germany, and then we saw that we would have to have the application be approved by the head of the clinic, and once that worked and we could prove a business case with the insurance company, then it could be introduced into the actual treatment regime. But I totally agree, and I totally forgot to mention also that it's like such a full-time job to even understand that whole ecosystem when you're coming into it as a startup company, that it sort of hits you like a brick wall. And it's something you don't expect at all.
I would say it hits you like a truck moving at full speed. It's really, coming in saying, hey, let's make this cool product. It's sort of, you're definitely not doing that in the medical space. So it is challenging, but luckily we're quite some companies now doing different type of lobbying and activities to try to change it. But it's a long path.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. I just kind of have a added point, I'd say. So I'm kind of getting the idea that there's a couple major barriers you guys both see in terms of societal acceptance, as well as producing more stimulation products. And Mark and I, both working in the sphere, are definitely on the same page as you, where more regulation is probably better to ensure that all the products being produced are definitely functional and aren't scams or Theranos or anything along those lines. But I kind of see three major blocks for societal exception. So the first would be kind of faulty or inappropriate applications. A really famous example is when the Chinese government tried to use BrainCo in schools. That's one off the top of my head. The second one would be people rushing to market too quickly and having to lie a bit about their products, and then there being significant backlash. And then the third would just be people not really understanding the field deeply enough to kind of appropriately produce products, but have it not be at all intentional and more just accidental, but kind of resulting in the same societal backlash. What are your kind of thoughts around that? Do you think that we'll be able to overcome that appropriately, or do you think that the field is going to get some societal pushback?
I completely agree, but I would say the backlash is already here, and I think the NeuroCo, or what they're called, the company who did the study in China,
BrainCo.
I think that's it. Yeah, thanks, BrainCo. It's a good example, and I think the opinion from the New York Times is another example of things being portrayed differently than they really are. So I think if you look at the actual study that BrainCo did, I don't see any problem with it whatsoever. I think it's completely a relevant use to monitor people's exhaustion during a school day to adapt learning. I think that makes a lot of sense. But if you then say, boo-hoo, the Chinese government are now mapping the brains of kids to make them learn quicker. If that's, and that was the news story was. And I actually had a meeting with someone from BrainCo about a year ago, where we spoke about, you try to do important, cool things, and then someone writes one newspaper article framing it in a way that makes it easy to tell, and then everyone think that China is mapping kids' brains, and that's actually not what it was about. So I think that the stories and the potential negative backlash from bad products are the two key problems as I see it.
Do you see any viable ways for us as a field to avoid those pitfalls?
Regulation is probably the most obvious one, but also public information. So I think we've invested a lot of time and effort in trying to be in the media and tell about it, but also be open about the complexity and the novelty and the uncertainties. And it's still a research project. It's just that you can pay to be part of it and get your own product, but we're very open about this still being a new technology that you are exploring. So we're sort of really trying to say it's a cool technology, but you have to use it to find out what it can do for you. And that makes it harder to sell the products, but that's sort of, I'll rather try to tell the true story than to say this will make you into superhuman, because then, in a year we will be out of business.
That brings up actually a nice segue to a question that was just asked. Why do you think your product is ready and worth €450?
Based on user feedback, I guess. We have a 30-day full, what is it called? Refund policy. So buy it, use it. If you don't find it useful after 30 days, return it to us. We have had 18 products returned on the first 1,800 shipped. So that's, in my point of view, great statistics. So we are working on lowering the price. We definitely think that it should be more accessible, but it's a tricky point of, if you sort of sell brain tech for $150, then you probably don't have the right components inside of it. That's, yeah.
I mean, what do you think is a sort of the minimum happy place? Like right now we have, high-end smartphone, low-end smartphone. Like I know what I'll get for those features. What do you think, where's the price level for your neurotech?
Yeah, so mid-range, I would say. We like to compare our pricing to the high end of noise cancelling headphones, the sort of top end, because part of what we do is noise cancelling for the brain. So it's the value proposition is sort of similar. Yeah, so I think that's the price point. And yeah, if we were in this to make money, we would have done as some of the other companies and just made a huge batch of really, really cheap products and pushed marketing really hard and then closed the company in 2 years when people hit us. And other people, unfortunately, are going that path.
Cool question from Mario. He said, we have a number of startups developing competing solutions. How much could users use different devices and applications in conjunction together? How compatible are different product approaches? For example, can I run an app of one company with the hardware of another? Is this desirable? I would say we need compatibility, open standards, and open source apps in order to democratize neuroscience.
Yes, go Mario. So two different things. One of them is the compatibility of different products. We have a lot of users who are reaching out to us saying, I'm using these 4 different products at the same time, and I got some weird messages on my Muse when I turned on Player Work, where it's sort of, oh yeah, but that's EEG and we're sending current and that's recording current, and so we definitely see a lot of people cross coupling these technologies, and we also do quite some collaborations with other companies in the field without mentioning names, where we sort of see what happens if you use multiple products at the same time, especially FNIRS and TDCS, TSCS. is a very interesting one, and also HRV, simple day HRV. I've seen such a systematic track in my own HRV measurements in a combination with TDCS, TACS. It's very consistent, and we see that across a lot of users, that they sort of you see it in your HRV when you are using TDCS, and it's so far away. So that's on the multiple tech at the same time. I think the open standards, yes, we should definitely have that. That's part of the research app we're building, is so it's more useful, like an API, raw data, everything. And we need that. Everyone need that. If you don't know what is happening inside the devices, then why would we trust them? The problem about it is that there is a safety aspect in it. So we do get warnings whenever someone have hacked or tampered with our products. We have people ripping our firmware during firmware updates, rewriting it, uploading it to our products. We see people doing a lot of reverse engineering, and it's still our hardware. So I'm skeptical to opening up too much, because if you sort of overwrite our safety features, for instance, in our firmware, then you might actually get a skin burn from a product which is designed not to do so. So I think it's sort of it's a fine balance. It should be open and transparent, but it might not be too hackable.
Yeah, somehow I just thought of Tesla, because I know they also had people trying to hack their firmware on their car, and then had to try and shut people down and stop them from doing that. Cool question from a composer in the audience.
Before we do that, I would just like to quickly touch on that question that we just had before as well. Another aspect that would be kind of useful to keep in mind, I guess, is there is some open source projects that try and merge different technologies and allow you to read more than one stream at once, such as EEG notebooks, which we mentioned earlier. And another useful thing is that as well as across different consumer products, so using EEG and FNIRS and TDOT and everything else, it's also useful to merge some consumer products within the same type. So for example, the Muse, which is on your forehead, could be merged with something that would read the occipital. And to just kind of play around and compare across there is pretty useful. And then lastly, I guess, is at least when I was working at Muse, one issue that we had was we used to have our SDK open and available publicly, but it became really, really expensive actually for the company, as well as challenging to have people being inappropriately using the Muse because they didn't understand how it worked, and then to get really angry, or to be in the Muse Facebook group and asking a whole bunch of questions, or to be misinterpreting their brain signals as something else. And we actually found, to circle back to the conversation before, it did a lot more harm than good to have people that didn't really know what was going on misinterpreting all their brain signals and reaching false conclusions. And it kind of concerned us, so it made more sense for us.
Yeah, I think just a short follow-up. I think the other thing to me is also there's a huge difference between, you know, lab hackable products for experts, where you have the flexibility and you trust that the people who are using them know if you get an error on your EEG while doing TACS, you understand why those two interfere. While if you look at the consumer products like Plate of Work, like Muse, it's not designed to be hacked. It's not designed to be played around with. So you can't. So for instance, we would crossfade TDCS and EEG, and neither Muse nor Plate of Work offer crossfading as a standard feature. So unless you can hack both, then you can't really use them in conjunction, and you will get some really weird results because the products are trying to make sense of what is happening, because they don't understand where all this current is coming from. You know, Muse isn't designed to be filtering out 2 milliampere on the skin.
Exactly. And especially, like I know when we're at Muse, if research groups asked to partner, we were happy to work with them and send them the SDK and help them interpret data, and as well as viable company partners. We had a ton that we would work with. But I think there is some legitimacy to trying to limit the general hacking of these consumer products, which are designed to be plug and play. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly touch on that though. There's another question, the one that Mark was about to read from a composer, which is quite interesting. So he says, "Hi there, I'm a composer and music producer working film to commercials to audio design and songwriting." Wow, super cool and multifaceted. "I am more and more fascinated by neuroscience and am getting into the field of using music and sound in neurological therapy, not the classical approach of relaxing music, but more of a personalized approach that a patient can get a unique audio therapy. I was wondering if you already used or implemented the audio aspect in your guys' work."
The short answer is unfortunately no. We have some friends at the University of Aalborg in Copenhagen that are doing quite some good lab scientific work on neural beats, but it's very challenging. To me, again, it's these sort of two paradigms. So as you say, Jan, as a personal approach, it might be very beneficial. But if you try to reproduce that on the population scale in a lab and see, can we find neural beats that are predictively causing more alpha states? That's really hard, but it might work super well for 5 people in the study. And I think that's sort of, again, the challenge with these technologies is some people have very strong effects very consistently, and other people are all over the map. So I think I would say when it comes to music therapies or music-based, sound-based therapies, I haven't seen any scientific sort of scale studies that are very convincing, but it doesn't mean that it's not a path that is worth pursuing. I think that, just back to Muse, I think the way they use music as a way of communicating and supporting your neurofeedback is a very nice approach.
Definitely, I'd agree. I think it's a field with a lot of potential to do the audio therapy, but I think it also requires a significant amount of data in order to do it correctly and to have a lot of meaning. So I think it's definitely going to be really exciting to watch where that goes in the future, but I don't think we're there quite yet.
But it's very nice to be part of these type of conversations because, normally when talking about these things, it's more about whether is it dangerous and is it what you see in the movies with people getting full-on electroshocks. That's the normal conversation. So I really like it. And I think, to me, we're talking about the brain, we're talking about electricity. And both those things are something that very few people actually fully understand. You might work with electricity, but the more you learn about it, the more magical it is, and same with the brain. So, most of the technologies we've been talking about today are somehow based on the brain and electricity. And for most people, that's two things that makes no sense. So what we're saying is, hey, let's couple up two things that makes no sense. You want to try it? And that's a hard thing to sell.
Definitely, especially once you layer on the AI black box solutions that most people are using on the data. It's a lot of unknowns in trying to reach a lot of conclusions. And there's a lot of exciting potential, but it definitely needs to be very thoughtful in its approach, I would say. Wonderful. Well, I think that is about our time, as now it is 20:30 in Zurich time, I guess. But it was really, really phenomenal talking to you. And thank you so much for staying and answering all these questions. That was a really interesting presentation and a really interesting conversation. And to all of our attendees, and to all of the attendees, thank you guys for coming. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
So we'll be back with NeuroTech Zurich and NeuroTech Berlin in the coming months. Looking forward to an awesome 2021. Lots of neurotech, lots of learning. and in some ways advancing, human society. So looking forward to having more conversations with you all in the future. And thank you very much, Baldur, and Abby, and Mohit, and Nick, who's no longer here.
And you, Mark. Yeah, wonderful. Have a great time, guys, and thanks so much for attending.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.